Let's talk about de-dollarization, because what's unfolding right now isn't just serious. It's seismic. The moment the G7 froze Russian assets, the global financial order felt a tremor. That wasn't just a policy move, it was a signal, loud and irreversible. Biden's decision to align with Europe and lock down Russia's reserves may have scored diplomatic points. But financially, it shattered something foundational. Trust. Trust in the US dollar. Trust in the neutrality of Western finance. Trust in the idea that money parked in America is safe no matter what. And if you're thinking Trump might have undone the damage, he didn't. His trade wars only accelerated it. His tariffs turned up the heat, making it painfully clear that the US is willing to weaponize its economic systems, trade, finance, infrastructure, as tools of foreign policy. It's a flex that plays well at rallies, but it comes at a price. Right now, foreign investors are holding about $19 trillion in US stocks, $7 trillion in government bonds, and another $5 trillion in credit assets. That's over $30 trillion in exposure. Just in treasuries alone, foreigners own nearly a third of the entire market. This isn't marginal capital. This is what keeps borrowing costs in the US low. This is what keeps the debt machine humming. But every time the US sharpens its economic edge, that trust erodes. And every time the rhetoric around protectionism escalates, capital gets a little more nervous. Trump loves to hammer the trade deficit like it's public enemy number one. But what he ignores is the other side of the equation, the capital account surplus. For decades, that surplus has been the quiet powerhouse, giving the US the ability to borrow globally at ultra-low rates. The trade deficit pulls money out, the capital surplus brings it back in. It's been a finely balanced dance. But now the music is changing, not just because central banks are buying fewer treasuries. Something deeper is shifting. A structural rethinking of the dollar's role is underway, and it's already starting to materialize. Take Brazil. They're preparing to issue panda bonds, debt denominated in Chinese yuan. That might sound technical, but it's monumental. For decades, if you wanted to borrow on favorable terms, you did it in dollars. The dollar's reserve status meant liquidity, confidence, low interest rates, and no currency risk. Everyone wanted dollar-denominated debt. Lula could borrow today at historically low rates just by sticking with the status quo. Brazil is a major exporter. In 2024 alone, they ran a $74 billion trade surplus, most of it in dollars. Borrowing against those future surpluses? Easy. Standard playbook. But now that playbook is getting burned. Tariffs, trade wars, financial unpredictability. Countries are rethinking their exposure to the dollar. Brazil just issued a 10-year dollar bond at 6.73%. US Treasuries? Around 4.5%. If US yields keep climbing, Brazil could be staring down 7%, 8% borrowing costs. But panda bonds? They're coming in at 2%. That's not just cheaper, it's a third of the cost. Sure, borrowing in yuan introduces currency risk. But China controls the yuan's trading band. They don't leave it to the markets. Meanwhile, the dollar is bouncing all over the place. Today it's down. Tomorrow it might spike. Tariffs get lifted or reimposed. Rates climb again. In that kind of volatility, dollar debt turns radioactive. Now factor this in. Brazil has a growing trade surplus with China. They're exporting more to Beijing than they're importing, roughly 313 billion yuan, or $44 billion. And as China cuts US food imports, Brazil steps in to fill the gap. That trade flow is only expanding, which means Brazil is accumulating yuan. And with more yuan, they have more collateral, more reason to issue panda bonds. And every new panda bond issued strengthens China's financial ecosystem while weakening the dollar's dominance. It's a feedback loop, and it's already spinning. Washington isn't prepared for this. The dream of reshoring, bringing manufacturing back home, sounds patriotic on paper. But the cost is global trade. The cost is the dollar's role as reserve currency. The cost is America's ability to borrow cheap and run massive deficits. You can't have it all. You can't shield your industries, command the world's reserve currency, and finance trillions in debt at bargain rates. Something has to give. And then there's China. For years, economists have begged Beijing to rebalance, stimulate domestic consumption, reduce export dependency. Well, here we are. But be careful what you wish for. China is staring down deflation. Consumer prices aren't rising, they're falling. CPI is forecast at just 0.3%. That gives Beijing a rare weapon. The power to inject massive stimulus without overheating the economy. No inflation risk means no constraint. They can spend, they can lend, they can reshape global capital flows. And they're starting with countries like Brazil, willing partners in a world slowly, steadily pulling away from the dollar. What we're watching isn't just a trend, it's the early chapters of a global reordering. The dollar isn't gone. It's still the giant, but for the first time in generations it's not untouchable. If US-China trade talks collapse, And that's no longer a distant possibility, but something inching closer with each passing day. China won't sit on its hands. They'll react instantly, forcefully, and with strategic precision. The People's Bank of China will slash the reserve requirement ratio, releasing a flood of new credit into the economy. Loans will surge, liquidity will overflow, and yields will tumble. China will start buying its own sovereign debt in bulk, flooding the domestic market with cash, sending panda bond demand soaring, and pulling global capital out of U.S. treasuries. And that's just the first domino. While China injects stimulus and opens the monetary floodgates, the United States will find itself boxed in, cornered, trapped by its own imbalance. Unlike China, America isn't facing a liquidity drought. It's facing the opposite. It's spending too much, borrowing too much, and now facing a market that is demanding higher returns just to hold its debt. Investors are beginning to flinch, not just at the size of the deficit, not just at the persistent inflation, but at the foundations of the dollar itself. If China starts importing more, drawing in more capital, more trade, more investment, while American yields rise and deficits balloon, the dollar begins to lose its gravitational pull. That's not theoretical. That's market math. So what options does Washington really have? It can't fuel more demand, not in the middle of a tariff war. The only tool left is to hit the brakes on supply. That means slashing government spending, freezing out new programs, reining in debt. That's the high-stakes calculation behind Besson's so-called beautiful bill. But it's not just about the budget. It's about defending the central pillar of American global power, the dollar's supremacy. And while this internal crisis brews in the U.S., the world outside isn't waiting. It's moving. A headline hits. Japan is quietly buying Russian oil again. 2 years of compliance, 2 years of energy drought suddenly broken. The sanctions are still officially in place, but they're starting to show fractures. Trump says he wants to bring the war to an end. The EU, meanwhile, is tightening the screws. Ursula von der Leyen is pushing to cut the oil price cap from $60 to $45. Not just that, she wants Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines permanently shut down. Full embargo. No Russian gas to Europe ever again. But this isn't just about energy or diplomacy. It's about financial architecture. It's about economic sovereignty. This is currency warfare. This is monetary fragmentation at a global scale. We are witnessing the slow, chaotic unraveling of a world built on a single assumption, that the US dollar would remain king. That assumption is fading. The West is turning back to its playbook, cut Putin's energy revenue. The logic is simple, the strategy familiar, but the timing feels off, almost reckless. Why now? Why escalate at a moment when the global economy is already fragile? When Trump's 20% tariff war is coming back to life? The effects of this are painfully predictable. Take cheap Russian energy off the table, and you create a chain reaction. Higher input costs, soaring prices, squeezed margins, shrinking exports. Factor in trade tariffs, and suddenly selling to the US becomes unviable. Economies stall, factories slow, growth grinds down. And who steps into the void? China. With every sanction imposed, every pipeline rerouted, China tightens its grip. Russia doesn't collapse, it redirects. Putin doesn't fall back, he reorients. Oil that once flowed west is now flowing east. Asia, not Europe, becomes the center of energy gravity. It's already happened, over and over again for the last 3 years. Europe seems to forget this every time the headlines shift. And now, one of America's closest allies is breaking ranks. Japan, a core G7 partner, is no longer pretending. A Japanese refiner just bought Russian crude, the first in 2 years. It's not an accident. It's not rebellion. It's math. Energy economics don't care about geopolitics. Sanctions don't erase the basic law of supply and demand. Japan needs energy to survive. And in their world, affordability is everything. Energy powers the entire system. Manufacturing, shipping, transportation, agriculture, exports. Countries like Japan, China, and Vietnam can't function without it. Pull affordable fuel out of the system and the entire economic structure begins to buckle. Japan's move isn't a gamble, it's calculated. They purchased 600,000 barrels of Russian crude, delivered on a blacklisted tanker. But the transaction was legal. Why? Because Japan has something rare. A waiver from the Biden administration, quietly granted during a more pragmatic era in US diplomacy. That waiver turns everything upside down. It gives Japan the legal authority to buy Russian oil, even from sanctioned sources. So what now? If Europe is serious about a full energy ban, it would need to sanction Japan. That's the uncomfortable part of modern sanctions. They're not precision weapons. They're blunt force tools that hurt indiscriminately. And when the global system is fragmenting, even allies start looking out for themselves. Japan is doing just that, and they have to. Japan imports over 80% of its energy, over 90% when it comes to oil. It's a highly industrialized country with virtually no natural resources of its own. Their economy runs on imported energy, and the machine is slowing. Since February, Japanese export growth has declined. The first 20 days of May? Negative. Exports down 3%. For most countries, that's manageable. For Japan, it's an alarm bell. June is already looking worse. Add to that Trump's returning steel tariffs, and the pressure intensifies. Over $1 billion of Japanese steel exports are now exposed. If those tariffs hold, even at a modest 10%, Japan will be forced to rewrite its industrial playbook. This isn't just about maintaining growth. It's about stopping economic blood loss. And when survival is on the line, the choice is narrow. Energy becomes the pressure point. Cut input costs fast or lose competitiveness entirely. But Japan's not just fighting tariffs or inflation. It's locked in a head-to-head battle with China, and China is playing hardball. One of China's energy giants, VYD, just dropped prices by 34%. That's not a glitch, it's part of a long game. This is the third straight year of systematic discounting by Chinese state enterprises. It's not a price cut. It's a war strategy. A coordinated state-backed economic offensive. Japan can't afford to stay on the sidelines. Their subsidies are drying up. Public patience is thinning. The political appetite to keep overpaying for energy, just to stay on Washington's good side, is evaporating. In this environment, buying Russian oil isn't treason. It's survival. It's logic. And Japan won't be alone. Other countries, quietly, discreetly, will follow. Russian energy is not disappearing. It's rerouting. The belief that sanctions alone could crush Russia's economy was always a convenient illusion. And the oil price cap? It's nothing more than a headline barrier against a tidal shift in global alignment. This is the new normal. Fragmented, unpredictable, necessity-driven geopolitics. There's no grand alliance. No unified West. Just countries making deals to survive. Every government is playing its own version of realpolitik. Every alliance is conditional. Every rule is negotiable. Japan has made its move. Survival over symbolism. And now the question becomes, who's next? Will the BRICS nations accelerate their efforts, issuing new renminbi-denominated bonds to bypass the Western financial system entirely? Will other US-aligned nations start striking under-the-radar energy deals with Moscow while giving public lip service to sanctions? The world is shifting. Fast. The structure is cracking. And the idea of a stable, rules-based international order built on American economic leadership, that might already belong to history. The new game is here, and no one's playing by the old rules anymore.
For the first time in the last 80 years, the US dollar, which once ruled the world, is facing its biggest threat. Right now, more than $7.5 trillion worth of US financial assets could soon be sold off by foreign governments. Countries like China, Russia, Brazil, and many others in Southeast Asia are no longer trusting the US dollar. Instead, they are starting to use their own money because they want control over their economies. They are not making speeches about it. They are taking action. This is not just another market dip or normal recession. In 2025, the US dollar has crashed harder than it has in years. The dollar index has dropped by 10% in the last 5 months, which brings it to levels we have not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve is currently holding interest rates steady, but it's almost certainly considering cuts to avoid a full-blown recession. However, these measures will only make things worse, and global investors are increasingly turning away from the dollar. And here's where things really start to change. Currencies in Southeast Asia are now going up in value. The Thai baht, the Indonesian rupiah, and the Singapore dollar have all gone up. That kind of growth hasn't happened since the early 2000s. These countries are making smart moves. They are trading in their own money, setting up new financial systems, and cutting their ties to the dollar. For decades, everyone believed the US dollar would always stay on top. But that idea is falling apart now, not with big announcements, but with quiet shifts in trade deals, real investments, and powerful economic decisions. And if things keep moving in this direction, it might not be BRICS that leads the charge. It could be the central banks of Southeast Asia, which are gaining strength and independence, that finally tip the balance. From 2023 to the first half of 2025, something happened that made many economists sit up and pay attention. China sold over $150 billion worth of United States government bonds. This was not a small adjustment or an attempt to play the markets for short-term gains. Instead, it appeared to be a planned and deliberate move, part of a larger strategy that has been quietly forming over the past few years. At first glance, some Western financial analysts dismissed this action as temporary or unimportant. However, when looking deeper at the trend, it becomes clear that China is not alone. More and more countries, especially members of the expanded BRICS Plus group, including the original five, along with Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, have also started reducing their holdings of U.S. government debt. This signals something bigger than just short-term financial reshuffling. It shows a worldwide loss of trust in the American financial system. For many years, the United States used its strong economy and control over global financial institutions to guide the economic decisions of other countries. Groups like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank gave loans to poorer countries, but these loans came with many conditions. Countries had to cut government spending, sell public companies, and open their markets to foreign businesses. These steps were said to help economies grow, but in the short term, they often caused pain. Public services were reduced, and local businesses struggled to compete with international companies. Over time, many countries, especially in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, began to feel that relying on the dollar and Western financial systems was hurting them more than helping. In 2025, this frustration has led to real change. Today, more than 43% of African debt is now owed to private lenders in China instead of the IMF or World Bank. Senegal, for example, is working to raise more money through taxes so it won't need to borrow from abroad. Argentina is another example. Its new president, Javier Milei, has made big changes to the economy, cutting government spending and removing currency controls. These changes have helped lower inflation and attract foreign investors again. Many countries are now moving away from using the US dollar in trade. In 2025, many BRICS countries officially stopped using the dollar for trade and started using their own currencies instead. One example is trade between India and Indonesia, which is now done in local currencies instead of the US dollar. Brazil is also distancing itself from reliance on the US dollar. They have created tools like BRICS Pay to allow countries to trade with each other using local money. In Africa, a system called the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, PAPSS, is helping countries trade with each other using their own currencies, not the dollar. Central banks, the institutions that manage money in each country, are also making changes. In 2025, more banks in Africa and Asia are adding Chinese money, the renminbi, to their currency reserves. This means they are slowly preparing for a future where the dollar is less important. A report from the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, OMFIF, said many central banks expect the dollar's role in global reserves to shrink over the next 10 years. This is why they are moving to gold and ditching the dollar. Trade around the world is also changing. The OECD, a group that tracks the global economy, said in 2025 that growth will slow down to just 2.9% this year and next. Countries are making new trade deals to reduce their risk. Some of these agreements use local currencies instead of the dollar. One example is the deal made between the European Union and Mercosur, which is a group of South American countries. This deal is designed to strengthen trade without relying so much on the dollar. But the most impressive rise against the dollar are the ASEAN currencies, which no one has paid attention to until recently. In April and May 2025, the US dollar lost ground across much of Southeast Asia, and that was a big win for the region. Currencies like the Singapore dollar, Thai baht, Malaysian ringgit, and others all got stronger, signaling a shift in investor confidence. Why did this happen? Experts point to several reasons. First, America's rising government debt made investors nervous. Second, inflation stayed low across Asia, making the region more stable. Third, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia were offering better interest rates. And finally, after Washington introduced new tariffs, investors started to lose trust in US trade policy. The currency moves were no small feat. In April alone, the US dollar fell nearly 3% against the Singapore dollar, ending at 1.31, and then dipped further in May to 1.28, its strongest level in over a decade. A similar pattern played out in Malaysia and Thailand, where the dollar dropped roughly 2.5% each month, ending May at 4.2 ringgit and 32.5 baht respectively. The Philippine peso followed suit, strengthening 2.5% in April and holding steady in May. Even Indonesia's rupiah, which often lags, showed momentum, with dollar falling more than 3% across the 2 months to 16,300 rupiah. So by the end of May, nearly every major ASEAN currency was not just stronger. It was climbing steadily. And this raises a key question. Is this simply a short-term reaction to US troubles? Or are we witnessing Southeast Asia quietly stepping into a more powerful economic role on the global stage? But this surge in currency strength isn't happening in isolation. It's directly tied to a shift in global trade, one accelerated by tariffs. The South Asian countries may have Trump's tariffs to thank. Because of these tariffs, trade between China and the US has dropped sharply in 2025. Companies around the world are now looking for new places to manufacture their goods where it's cheaper and easier to do business. As a result, countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand have become new manufacturing centers. Large global companies, such as Apple and Intel in Vietnam, and HP and Dell in Malaysia, have invested a lot of money in building factories and expanding production in these countries. This increase in foreign investment has helped local economies grow faster. It also made their currencies stronger. At the same time, ASEAN countries are starting to trade more using their own currencies instead of the US dollar. This change helps them avoid currency risk and makes trade within the region cheaper and faster. To support this move, the countries also introduced a shared QR code payment system. This system allows people and businesses in different ASEAN countries to pay each other using their local currencies by simply scanning a code. It's already working in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So far, the results are clear. ASEAN is becoming more important in the global economy. The rise in local currency usage, stronger investment, and the shift of trade from the US and China to Southeast Asia are all